Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference. We're honored to be joined today by reporter and editor Brian Bienkowski, whose stories largely focus on environmental health and justice. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE-Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE-Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. And we do this in large part through our monthly teleconferences. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org, and that is health and environment all spelled out. As I said earlier, there are no formal presentation materials for this call. I'll be asking Brian some questions, and then we hope you'll join the conversation with your questions and comments during the last 10 to 15 minutes. This is our third in a series of CHE-Alaska calls focusing on the significant contribution that investigative journalists make in illuminating the science on the health effects of chemical contaminants, and in bringing us the stories of individuals and communities taking action to protect environmental health. Advocating for environmental justice is at the very core of the work of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Indigenous communities in the far north are disproportionately exposed to harmful chemical contaminants from military waste, and also from industrial contaminants from all over the world that migrate to the north and end up in the fish, wildlife, and people there. We seek to remedy this injustice through community-based research and advocacy. We also help to bring an environmental justice perspective to national and international policymakers by supporting delegates from Indigenous communities in the circumpolar north to meet with decision makers from around the world. Much of our work begins with an individual or community contacting us because they have a concern about contamination and have been largely ignored by those responsible for the pollution or the cleanup. So when we reached out to Brian Bienkowski for this call, we were thrilled that he agreed to join us, given his track record of reporting on environmental justice stories, including an in-depth story about the continued contamination of fish and Yupik people on remote St. Lawrence Island in Alaska. Brian is an award-winning journalist and editor at Environmental Health News and the Daily Climate. His stories on environmental justice, endocrine disruption, climate change, and water quality have been published in Scientific American, the San Francisco Chronicle, Wired, InsideClimate News, and many other publications. And I think our Alaskan participants in particular will appreciate this about Brian. He lives in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in a house where dogs outnumber people. When not waving a fly rod around, he's sending mandolin notes over the St. Mary's River to Canada, or wearing out hiking shoes with his fiancée. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your expertise and perspective as a reporter focusing on environmental health and justice stories. Before we delve into the issues, we'd love it if you could tell us a little more about yourself and about Environmental Health News.
Sure thing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome.
And I
well,
might interject if at any point in time the line gets a little fuzzy or I can't hear you, forgive me, but I will probably just interject and ask you to speak up or do whatever it takes to get clearer.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invite. I've been a fan of your organization's work for a long time now. And it's really an honor to be here, and I'm kind of humbled that people would want to spend an afternoon listening to me talk about these things. It's really wonderful. So thank you all out there who are sitting on mute. We do have quite a rainstorm here in the Upper Peninsula today. So if it gets loud, just let me know. I'll move. But so as Diana said, I'm the editor of Environmental Health News. I've been here and the Daily Climate, our sister site, for I think it's going on 7 or 8 years now. I started as a staff writer and have kind of moved into more of an editorial role. I still do some writing. So Environmental Health News covers, for those of you who aren't familiar, what you might expect. We cover the kind of the intersection of the environment and human and wildlife health. And that often lends itself to writing about toxics, endocrine disrupting chemicals, air and water quality, a lot of children's health reporting, and we've been at it for a while, and we're really pushing to do more of our original reporting now, because we have this whole other side of our website where we aggregate the top environmental health news of the day. Every morning, we're up super early so we can send out a newsletter called Above the Fold, which we like to think is the best of its kind around, where before you even get into work or wake up in the morning with your cup of coffee, we like to have that newsletter to everybody's inbox so you can have the top 12 to 20 stories of the day that you need to know if you're interested in environmental health. So those are kind of the two main things that we do, and we've expanded in different ways, but I can get into that later if we have time. So that's kind of the rundown.
Okay, great, Brian, and thank you. And that the website to subscribe to Above the Fold newsletter, and I certainly encourage you to do so, is ehn.org. That's the Environmental Health News website, ehn.org. So we hope that you'll follow through and do that if you haven't already. I'd like to begin by asking you, Brian, to talk about legacy contaminants, what they are, where we find them, and why their persistence is indeed an environmental justice issue.
Sure. So, I'm not sure of the exact what scientists would tell you the definition of a legacy contaminant is, but the way I think about it, and I think this is relatively accurate, is things like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, dioxins, lead, mercury, chromium, some pesticides like DDT. So a lot of these chemicals that at one point in our country's history or other nations that we used and put into the environment, and in many cases we realized were bad and harming either wildlife or us, and banned them. And unfortunately, a lot of these chemicals and compounds have a habit of being very persistent in the environment. And up there, the St. Lawrence Island example that you mentioned is a great example of PCBs that were put into the environment, years ago, decades ago in many cases, that kind of travel up the food chain. So they get stuck in things like sediment and water, will get into small aquatic wildlife, that gets into fish, that gets into people, and now you have a chemical that's biomagnified, so to speak, right up the food chain. So a lot of these chemicals are just really problematic, because even once you realize they're bad and they're banned, they're out there and they're not going away anytime soon. So, where are they? If you think about things like, Superfund sites, brownfields, hazardous waste sites, former coal plants, those are the real obvious examples to think about where some of these legacy contaminants are. And there's also, some of these compounds, we call them legacy, but things like mercury, we still put mercury into the environment where there's coal plants and stuff. So some of these compounds, while we call them legacy, there is ongoing pollution, near places that are putting these into the atmosphere. So the environmental justice link to these, and this could go any number of different directions. But I looked up a couple stats before I got on, and I don't want to talk about numbers too much because it would be boring for me and for the listeners. But there was an EPA and Department of Housing and Urban Development study recently that looked at the country's contaminated sites. These are hazardous waste sites and other heavily contaminated Superfund sites. And about 70% of the country's contaminated sites are near low-income housing. That's an astonishing figure to look at something like that. And then, what I've focused on, most of my environmental justice reporting has been looking at tribal environmental justice issues. And just a small example, out west, the uranium milling that went on years ago, some 90% of uranium milling in the United States took place on or just outside the boundaries of Native American reservations. And in both of these cases, you have this kind of lingering legacy where even if the uranium milling was shut down or these Superfund sites are quote unquote cleaned up, you have this kind of generational impact. The idea that this pollution is a nuisance or an annoyance is really a fallacy. This pollution is really a generational game changer, because when you think about low-income communities of color that are located near these sites, when you talk about some of these contaminants and what they do to people, it has impacts at the childhood level up into adolescence and into adulthood that could cause decreased days of school, decreased work output, and kind of has this cascading impact. So I'll stop there for a second, and we can get into other issues. But I hope that was a semi-decent summary of the legacies.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I guess I would like to know, or many of us would be interested in understanding how like the current era of deregulations is affecting environmental justice priorities and what we can expect for the future with that, just in our current administration.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't think there's been any secret that the Trump administration has been on a real push for deregulation and rollbacks of a lot of environmental protections. And it's all come from the standpoint, obviously, of economic gains and economic development. And we could and people should certainly debate the merits of what they're doing. But just from a very practical standpoint, what I see having come out of the administration has been a lot of negatives and loss for people who are wanting public health protections. So, just a couple examples off the top of my head. There was the Obama administration wanted to put in rules or bans on chlorpyrifos, which is a weird name, but it's a pesticide that's used in this country a lot out west in the Central Valley of California, where a lot of our food is grown. And in terms of environmental justice framework, a lot of the people applying this pesticide are migrant workers, either Latino families that may or may not be documented and therefore don't kind of have the political voice, the political will to stand up. And the Pruitt EPA decided that to scrap the Obama plan to regulate this chemical. And chlorpyrifos is by all accounts very harmful to children. And this isn't controversial science. I mean, this is this has been pretty well established that it's linked to birth defects and developmental problems in children. So I think that's a really glaring example of one rollback. But then even when we think about some of the climate deregulation, some of the climate rollbacks, a lot of that fossil fuel pollution, and this gets lost in the climate debate, I think, a lot when we talk about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. And climate change is is an enormous issue that impacts us all. But a lot of those plants, coal plants and so on and so forth, are putting out harmful pollution too. I mentioned mercury earlier, nitrous oxides and other particulate matter. This is pollution that both irritates the respiratory tract, but it's also been linked to increased heart problems for people. So when we look at this kind of massive effort to give coal and fossil fuels firm footing and roll back climate protections, that's also a very acute public health story too, I think. So across the board, it's at the regulatory level, at least at the federal level, it's been pretty bad news for the public health community. And we can talk later about maybe some positive signs and some good signs, but I think what you're seeing is a lot of states and market forces picking up the slack, where the federal government is maybe taking their foot off the gas a little bit in protecting people and the environment.
Thanks, Brian. And before I go on to inviting you to talk about endocrine disrupting chemicals, I did just want to give you an opportunity if there was anything else that you wanted to say about, setting the stage for environmental justice issues in case I skipped over anything.
Yeah, I would, and thanks for drawing me back. So as I said, I have written and spent a lot of my career looking at tribes. So where I live in Chippewa County, Michigan, up in the eastern UP, and I live near the reservation for the Sault Ste. Marie Chippewa Indians. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan has a few different tribes, so it's an issue kind of near and dear to me. And we did a large series a couple years ago, and I hope at least some of you saw it, called Sacred Water, that looked at this contamination issue. And a couple of things stood out to me in that series that I'd like to talk about a little bit today. That I think there are some environmental justice issues that are very that are very specific to tribes and impacts very specific to tribes and indigenous people that are important to take into account. So I spent some time out at the Crow Reservation in Montana. And the Crow is just one example of this. You could look at many tribes and see this. And so there's a very bad uranium contamination problem out there. And it's they're still trying to tease out where this is coming from, whether it's legacy mines or naturally occurring uranium, but it's getting in the water of the people. But if you just take a look at that one aspect, that's a problem, that's bad, it's a potential health problem. But with the Crow and with a lot of the tribes I visited, it kind of fits into this broader picture of neglect. The Crow, for example, has, I want to say, 13% or so living on the reservation have diabetes. More than 30%, more than 35% are obese. And of course, you can't necessarily pin these problems on the contamination, but it kind of paints this picture of this much broader problem of health impacts compounded by ongoing contamination and this complete, we've never fully defined tribal sovereignty. And we saw this fight play out very publicly at Standing Rock, where the Crow Reservation, or when I visited the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin, the tribe has been fighting to take control over their water. And for them, what goes on upstream impacts their water, impacts what's going on their reservation. And technically, the way we have our laws set up, the U.S. government should be dealing with the Crow or any other tribe as another government, as a fellow entity. And of course, we know that that's really never been the case, and tribal sovereignty has never really been defined. So I think it's just kind of this broader issue with tribes, where it not only impacts their health and feeds into these other social problems, but it contaminates their culture and their ability to use the water, the fish in the water, places that are of historical and cultural importance to them. So you're contaminating people physically, and you're contaminating a culture. So it's just a real ugly double whammy for a lot of tribes that I visited and that I've written about, including, as you mentioned, the Yupik people on St. Lawrence, who have been dealing with this PCB contamination for decades, I believe. And again, this trickles into a loss of culture. You maybe don't want to eat the fish that are contaminated with these chemicals. And maybe the fish were a cultural touchstone where you taught how to fish, or you told stories. So it's really sad, and I just think there's been a kind of a history and pattern of neglect that I think everybody knows about when it comes to tribes, and environmental justice is just one more insult to pile up.
Thanks, Brian. I think I'm going to, well, first of all, I did want to just mention that ACAT has been doing a lot of work with the people of St. Lawrence Island on studying contaminants in the traditional foods, and you can find more information on our website or by calling our office at 222-7714. And for folks that are out of Alaska, the area code is 907. So 907-222-7714. If you'd like to learn more about the collaborative research that has been going on there for well over a decade that ACAT has been involved in. But I am going to switch gears here and just ask you to speak a little bit about endocrine disruptors. I know several of your articles have focused on the current science on endocrine disrupting chemicals, including bisphenol-A and PFAS. You may want to talk about others as well, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on and perspectives about this issue that is of mounting concern to people and becoming a little bit more well known.
Sure, and the latter part of that sentence is a positive. It's a good thing that they're becoming well known. The man who started Environmental Health News and is our chief scientist, Pete Myers, who maybe some of you know, started talking about BPA and other chemicals years ago in his book Our Stolen Future, and I feel like people are really starting to catch on. So anyway, so endocrine disruptors are a class of chemicals that either mimic or interfere or alter our body's hormones in some way. And as many of you know, our hormones drive a lot of our bodily systems, a lot of our biological systems. So they're crucial for proper development and kind of day-to-day living for a lot of our body systems. So these chemicals are found, BPA, for example, it's used to make plastics hard and shatterproof, and found in everything from certain receipt paper, thermal paper, to food packaging. It lines the cans that you buy your canned foods in. Phthalates are another really popular endocrine disrupting class of chemicals, and they're found in fragrances and cosmetics. Flame retardants are found in our furniture and other electronics to prevent and suppress fires. So these compounds are hard to study for researchers, because the difference between we often think of the dose makes the poison, right? So we think of things like lead or heavy metals, where the more you ingest of this toxic, of this bad actor, the more likely you are to suffer some kind of health impact. Well, endocrine disruption science has kind of flipped that on its head somewhat. And what scientists have been finding for years now is that some of these compounds, BPA included, have different impacts at different doses, and it doesn't always mean a high amount is bad. It could be a dose in the middle of the exposure. Maybe somebody who had a lot and somebody had a little. Someone in the middle has the highest impact. So it all kind of depends on. There a lot of animal studies are looking at different health endpoints. So it's really fascinating science and really scary stuff as a consumer and as a person, because most of us are exposed to these compounds on a daily basis. BPA, the most recent studies I've seen, more than 90% of people have some in their bodies. So it's a widespread problem, and BPA has been linked to everything from altered sexual development to changes in metabolism, how we handle insulin and glucose, impaired learning and memory, stress, obesity. So it's scary science, and we're finding more and more of these compounds every day.
And Brian, it's true that you've written a lot on BPA, correct? So there's a lot of articles that can be found on the Environmental Health News website that track that particular chemical.
Yeah, I've written quite a bit about BPA and phthalates too. Yep, those are the two I'd say, and you can definitely find my name attached to a lot of BPA things.
So given this mounting evidence that low-dose exposures are dangerous, especially during critical windows of human development, I know that's something we've held a number of our calls with researchers who are looking specifically at that, at how important it is to identify the times in human development when even that smallest amount of a chemical can have large consequences. So, what is or is not our government doing to protect us from this harm, I guess, is my question.
That's a good question. And one of the things that shocked me when I first became an environmental reporter years back was this assumption that I think most people have. I'm sure most people on this call are probably they probably know more than I do on some of this stuff. So maybe this isn't the right venue, but I feel like a lot of consumers just assume that our government, everything that's in our products has been completely vetted and tested. And that's just not the case. That is not the case. And it's a little stunning when we start peeling back the layers of the onion, to really see what we're putting out there. So I think at any one time the EPA has 300 or so new chemical cases under review that they're looking at. So we can point our finger at the EPA and the changes under the Toxic Substance Control Act. We're supposed to make this a little more rigorous process, but the bottom line is they are inundated with new chemicals constantly. And so for many of these endocrine disruptors, BPA included, I believe BPA has been banned in baby cups, sippy cups, but still approved for the uses I mentioned earlier. Phthalates are still used in cosmetics, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has statements on these compounds and has deemed them safe for use in the products that they're still used in. And there's just a real controversy between what the government has said and what most academic scientists have said about these chemicals. And a lot of that boils down to different testing practices. I would certainly defer to somebody more in tune with the science on this, but essentially the outcry from a lot of academic scientists is that the FDA and other government agencies are using dated science that doesn't take into account what you mentioned, the different, the important times of exposure in development and how crucial that can be. That doesn't take into account non-monotonic dose response, which is a really jargony way of saying that small doses can impact us. It's not always the dose makes the poison. So you can really get in the weeds on the different type of testing, but that's the crux of it. Is academic scientists are saying that they're moving forward with progressive, cutting-edge science that's teasing out impacts on chemicals that the FDA and EPA and others aren't able to see, or maybe aren't willing to see in some cases due to dated testing.
And something that you mentioned early on was about how, as consumers, we assume that what is on the shelves is safe. And I think you're absolutely right. Many people on this call know that that's not true, but what we want to know also is if BPA is eliminated from something, can we still be buying a hard plastic container? Or, I've heard a lot about how the chemical that is used to replace BPA, because it actually kind of does the same thing, it might also have the same health effects. And do you know anything about how that's being sorted out to know if the alternative chemical is actually safer?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Or do we just need to avoid hard plastic? Is the education to just avoid hard plastics?
Well, I hate to alter somebody's day-to-day living, because it's hard to keep track of all the things that may or may not hurt us. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When you look at, I've written about this a little bit, and I don't think it's any secret that BPA, we get those BPA-free Nalgene's, and we feel good for a week, and then we see the next headline that says BPS, bisphenol-S, has a lot of the same impacts. And bisphenol-S, what happens is, you don't have to be a chemist to understand that bisphenol S and bisphenol A are going to have similar molecular structures, right? And the reason they do that is because it works. It's really efficient at what it does when it's added to plastic. So what chemical manufacturers are trying to do is BPA is having its moment as something the public doesn't want. So let's find something very similar and put that in. And maybe we don't have the rigorous testing structure in place to find out beforehand that, BPS turns out it does a lot of the same things that BPA does. And we saw this with the PFAS compounds. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the actual name, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen the headlines where this class of chemicals, these perfluorinated compounds, are being found throughout the United States. And a lot of this was used in Teflon products, PFAS and a couple others, and a lot of those compounds have been replaced by similar other highly perfluorinated compounds, and of course now we play this catch-up game of the scientists trying to tease out whether this next class of chemicals that we're putting in the environment are doing the same thing. So yeah, it's a real game of toxic whack-a-mole, and unfortunately we've set up the system where scientists are constantly trying to play catch-up to see what has been put into the environment that may hurt us, instead of us catching that at the front end and just not putting it in the first place. Right.
It's a big challenge. I know for me, as a person who wants to be very conscious of all of these choices, it's really tough. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll move to a system where entire classes of chemicals are regulated. I know that a lot of people working on these issues are working for that. And maybe some of them are on the line with us today and can add more about that work when we get to our discussion time. So I would like to tie this all back to our focus on environmental justice a little and ask you, in your stories and reporting, what are you seeing about how exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals in particular are disproportionate and are indeed an environmental justice issue?
So I think this is an aspect of EDC science that is yet to be fully fleshed out. But I think just from a very intuitive level, so we're getting to the point where we're realizing what's bad and what isn't, right? And we're trying to keep up, like we just said. But when you think about, so maybe I have the means and the capability to go get a water bottle, or maybe my sister has the means to feed her children organic. A BPA-free water bottle I meant for myself. And if you think about who are the people that aren't able to maybe keep up on the front end of the market, when the market's kind of telling us what's gotten rid of certain compounds and certain chemicals, and of course those are people with limited financial means. Those are people in remote and rural areas where maybe there isn't the options that we find in our major cities. And so I think it's just another example of compounds and chemicals, the burden being shifted to people of lower income in our country. And you can look at whether that's pesticides in our food or what are the cheaper cosmetics. Ultimately, we're going to have cosmetics that are phthalate free, and of course, when they first hit the market, they're going to be a little more expensive. So you just kind of shift everything into a higher, a higher purchasing area, higher purchasing bracket, and that naturally lends itself to people with lower means continuing to buy the things that are have more harmful chemicals in them, just out of necessity and because that's what they can afford. So again, this hasn't been fully fleshed out, but I just think from an intuitive level, you can see where this is all headed.
And that's also where that issue of kind of compounding factors comes in, because if folks that are lower income can't purchase the products that are safer, and their kids are going to schools and buildings that are older and have these other contaminants in them, it's all just kind of adding up cumulatively. So
yeah, I think, if you didn't leave this conversation with anything else, I think the most important thing that I've learned and that I see in environmental justice, in the environmental justice issue, is the fact that the pollution is just one very small part of it. If we take something like Flint, Michigan, for example, which is, a few hours down the road from me here, that's a community that has its economic infrastructure eroded. And now you have this poisoning of the children that happened. And of course, lead is linked to behavioral problems and learning disabilities. And now you have a whole generation of children, and hopefully they're able to get some intervention, and this isn't the case. But, you're going to have some children who suffered through no fault of their own and are poisoned. And now you have families growing up with children who maybe have a more difficult time in school, who have a more difficult time landing a job, and this kind of cycle continues. And I think that's really important when you think about what this pollution does to people and families.
Thanks, Brian. And I think I speak for many folks on the line when I say that the science is sobering, the trend towards deregulation is troubling, and the fact that there's a disproportionate burden that certain vulnerable populations bear, that is also very discouraging. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless to make positive change. And I did get a question actually from somebody on the call who just emailed me. And she says, so much of the news and information that we report on is bad news. What are some ways to engage the public who is exhausted from so much bad news when it comes to environmental health?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's the kind of question. There's two questions. It's sort of what positive things are happening, but also how can we engage people who feel exhausted and that they can't do it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because it's so important, especially, where I work. We struggle with this all the time. It's like, well, geez, who wants to read our newsletter every morning? I mean, come on. It's the daily bummer, really. Even if you find the stuff important and you work in it, it's a grind. So a couple of things. I'll address the idea of what's positive, what's happening. Just in the last couple of weeks, I jotted down a few notes here. I saw today that Hawaii banned chlorpyrifos, that pesticide that I mentioned. I know Lowe's, the big home improvement store, banned a really harmful chemical that's in paint removers, paint strippers. SeaWorld banned plastic straws. IKEA banned single-use plastic. I saw that Kourtney Kardashian, one of the Kardashians, has this big cosmetic campaign where she's trying to address phthalates and other harmful compounds in cosmetics. And, again, maybe all these things are corporate greenwashing to some extent, but some of them are meaningful action. And I think what you see is, in the absence of federal regulation, when people deem something a really big problem, and maybe we're late to the party, but things like plastic pollution, for example, you're seeing companies don't have the option. They can't hide anymore. This is something that people want. So ultimately, the power of the purse, the power of the wallet, I think can really speak to corporations to make change. I think some other really good things you're seeing real quick. I think you're seeing a lot more solutions, active journalism. I know where I work, we've kind of gotten past this idea. When I first started, I had very awesome mentors that came from traditional newsrooms, and they would probably scoff at some of the things that I write and have written now because we try to take an active voice now. I consider myself a straight news reporter, and I expect my reporters to respect objectivity and all that good stuff. But at the same time, I don't have any problem saying that injustice is wrong and pollution is bad. And when we write stories, we come at it from that angle. We totally recognize the need for economic development and all that good stuff, and we all need energy and all that. But at the same time, we can be very clear that people shouldn't disproportionately suffer from things, and we want to hold truth to power. So that kind of active journalism, I think, is a very good thing. I think you're seeing a lot more diversity in newsrooms, which I can't say enough about. I just think that's kind of the key to a lot of this environmental justice reporting, is having people from indigenous communities, from tribes, from having African American journalists, Hispanic journalists, Puerto Rican journalists, people from all stripes to get into these newsrooms so they can really bring these issues to the forefront. Because I can write about tribes from my perspective as a white guy that grew up in Metro Detroit. But ultimately, I think it's best served by the people who grew up in those communities, who understand these cultural differences. So I think that diversity in newsrooms is a really good thing. And then your reader's question about how can we engage people. So what I can speak to what we try to do, and I do think it's hard, and it's probably different for every organization and whatever your audience is. But we try to sprinkle in what I would consider, I think solutions is a little squishy term, but stories of people doing things that are positive that maybe we could expand. Maybe we can do more. So this week we have a really large series on asthma in Pittsburgh. So we started off early in the week looking at these really depressing asthma rates, and children in poorer communities and near industrial polluters having these really, spiked asthma rates. So what we did today and tomorrow as well with a video is we went and visited a screening clinic where this pediatrician started this very small program, where she's seeing these excellent results where children are not only realizing they have asthma and they're catching it early so they don't have permanent problems, but also engaging parents. So what we try to do as a news outlet is shine a bright light on that and say, hey, here's something that can be done that's working in this very small corner of Pittsburgh. And I think if you poke around hard enough in any community, that's going on. And as a news, as an editor, and I think as outlets, it's the onus is on us to really make sure that those stories are told too, and not just a constant barrage of bummer.
So, as an editor, I'm sure your outlook has changed a bit. And when we talked earlier, you talked about, changing perspectives about ending the notion of there being two sides, and also how stories come up from the community. So before we move into our discussion time, and also on a positive note, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about your role as editor of an environmental news publication and what you're learning through that. And you touched on it already, but you may have more to say about that.
Yeah, so the one thing I did mention is taking a real active voice with maintaining our objectivity and full reporting, but again, that pollution is bad and injustice is wrong, and that's kind of the standpoint that we'd like to start from. One thing that we're trying to do this year, we've been a national publication for as long as I was there, and what we did this past year was we saw an opportunity to take what we do and have a real laser focus in a local, more of a local capacity. So we kind of have this local initiative in Pittsburgh, which is an odd place, of course, because I'm in Michigan and my director's in Bozeman, Montana. But we found just an excellent reporter in Pittsburgh, Christina Marusik, who started for us. And the idea there is to kind of take this, what we're covering nationally. We always kind of viewed our role as filling in the blanks where the large media outlets, mainstream coverage is missing on some toxics and stories, and tried that at a local level. And there's excellent environmental reporting going on in Pittsburgh, but we wanted to focus like a laser on environmental health and try to move that needle to try to end some of the problems like we spotlighted this week, childhood asthma, for instance, and see where our journalism can produce real change. The other thing you mentioned, stories that bubble up from communities, and I think this is really pertinent for this call. I don't know how many of your callers come from, in Alaska there, where maybe there isn't the big news story or big news outlets to cover things, but I think it's really important for communities to push to get their stories out there. And what I tell my reporters now, and what I've tried to do is, I think journalists in general tend to really rely on quote unquote expert sources, and these three-letter acronym agencies and so on and so forth. But the real stories are out in the community. And all of the tribes that I mentioned that I covered, if you look at Flint, Michigan, all of these stories were there waiting to be told. And the community was just crying out for a journalist or a reporter. And they were saying, something is wrong here. There is a problem here. And in most of those instances, we waited until a quote-unquote expert, whether it's a university person or a state official, to tell the media that, oh, indeed, there is lead in the water lines. And I just think as an editor, what could have been done in a place like Flint if they would have if reporters would have listened to the community months prior when they were crying out that the water was wrong. So, and that's not an indictment on any local reporting. It's hard. It's a hard job, but I do think it's a good lesson that as reporters, we really need to listen to communities because these are the people with firsthand knowledge of what's going on and on the front lines of this pollution.
Thank you, Brian. And I think this is actually a really good segue to invite our participants to join the conversation, as many of them may come from communities that are facing issues. We also may have people that are working on other aspects of these toxic contaminant concerns. So at this time, I would like to invite questions from our participants. And if you'd like to ask a question, please just press *2 to unmute your line. It's helpful if you state your name and if you are affiliated with a group or community and you want to mention that. We always like knowing that as well. And when you're finished with your question, if you press *2 again, it will mute your line, and that's really helpful so that we don't end up with a lot of background noise by the end of the call. So now we have about 15 minutes, and we're really looking forward to, eager to hear what people may want to ask of Brian or comments and contributions they want to make.
Hi, this is Jeannie from the Farm Worker Association of Florida. Can you hear me?
It would be helpful if you could speak up just a little bit. I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay, hi. Yes, hi. This is Jeannie from the Farm Worker Association of Florida. And we work with farm workers that have been or are being exposed to pesticides, including I work with a group of largely African-American farm workers that were exposed to decades and generationally to legacy pesticides. So basically my question is, we have a very hard time getting reporters in Florida to do stories on farm workers and pesticide issues. And I've been told by reporters in the state that there's very few reporters in Florida that are doing any kind of environmental reporting, much less environmental justice reporting. So we've had a hard time getting stories out about farm workers and pesticide exposure, whether it's through radio or print or any other kind of media. So just kind of wanted to know if there's any thoughts or suggestions about that, and I'll go on mute. Thanks.
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. We did a really large series last year on rural issues in Iowa and North Carolina, looking at hog farm waste. What you're saying is certainly not, you're not alone in that. I think a lot of states, the environmental reporters have been laid off. You do have a very good one, Craig Pittman, down there. What I would suggest to you, and I think, and maybe this is a little self-serving and a little biased, but I think a really good way to get your story out and to get the attention of larger publications, if you think the local print and radio would be, most beneficial, is to start, write someone like me, write maybe the Daily Yonder, who they cover specifically rural issues, or maybe Earther, who does a lot of environmental justice issues. If you find these kind of niche publications who dedicate their time, or Center for Public Integrity is another good one. If you write the editors or reporters at those kind of publications, again, people like me, a lot of times what happens is you get a story that's put out. I can't tell you how many stories I've done, and then next month you see The Guardian is writing about it, or another large publication. And a lot of times that's how it works. It takes another news organization to tease out, wow, this is a really big, important story, which it sounds like you have. And then you get the attention of maybe the bigger fish.
So I got Center for Public Integrity. What were the other ones? I'm sorry.
You know what, Jeannie? What I think I'd like to do is have Brian, if you send me the names of those niche publications, I'd love to share that with our participants. Does that work?
Sure thing.
For you,
sure thing.
As a follow-up. Yeah, and that way everyone can have them, and I'll have the links to contact them as well. Thanks for your question, Jeannie. Is there anyone else who would like to chime in on this? Press *2 to unmute your line.
Hi, this is Jessica. I'm the Civic Engagement Organizer at Alaskan Action on Toxic.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and I'm the Civic Engagement Organizer. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So my question was for Brian. There might not be a definite answer, but I know that we have, heavy metals in our bodies, like pathways, maybe flame retardants. So I'm just wondering, how do we as individuals, how can we get these metals out of our systems? What are the ways that we can, if we do have it in our bodies, do we know what we can do about it?
So just to make sure I heard correctly, so you're looking for, so we were exposed to all these things that I mentioned and bummed you all out. So you're asking, well, what can I do about it to avoid or decrease that exposure?
Yeah.
I think the first place to start, at least for me in my household, is food. We have a lot of control over what we eat. I know easier said than done, but organic seems to be a good thing for the most part. In terms of kind of the endocrine disrupting compounds that I mentioned, things like glass and metal as containers, you don't have this problem. That's certainly one place to start. I'm trying to think of other ways to go about avoiding exposure to that. The flame retardants, these are, we are seeing more and more labeling on things like furniture. You can find flame retardant free furniture. And a lot of those, from what I understand, they don't have any kind of that toxic replacement going in there. It's just, it doesn't have the fire retardant chemicals in there.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
If it's already in your system, are there ways to detoxify it out of your body? How do people do that if it's already in your system?
It is difficult to hear you. Brian, did you understand the question? I think she's asking.
I did.
How do you detoxify? Can you get it out of your body?
Yeah. And unfortunately, I really wish I could help you. I wouldn't be the one to answer that. I will say stuff like BPA, phthalates, a lot of these real kind of infamous chemicals, endocrine disruptors, they don't have a terribly long half-life in our bodies. They are pretty rapidly metabolized. I know that's not I know that's not too comforting, because if we're finding it in more than 90% of the people, that means exposure is, continuous and consistent. But, most of these things are excreted and metabolized by our body relatively fast, at least the chemicals I mentioned. So really, if you talk to researchers, the best way to detoxify is to kind of avoid exposure in the first place. Sorry, I couldn't be more helpful.
Thank you. That would be an excellent topic for a future Che Alaska call, though. If there are, if we can find some experts out there who do know what we can do after the fact, but certainly preventing the exposure in the first place is a good place to start. And more importantly, demanding that our policymakers change policy to be more protective. So thank you, Jessica. I would also like to let everyone know we still have about 5 minutes or so. And so if there are other folks with questions or comments, we sure hope you'll join the conversation. Press *2 to unmute your line.
Yeah, hi. This is Steve Seymour from Cape Cod.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to comment that in Hyannis on Cape Cod, they do have those what we call perfluorinated chemicals, the PFASs and the PFOA. And it was from a fire training facility that on county land that the fire departments used for years. And it impacts Hyannis. I think about half of Hyannis is actually environmental justice area. And people don't think of a lot of times that way, but there was a lot of old Navy housing from World War II, and that housing still exists. It's pretty much, small houses, and that's the deal there. I worked in Hyannis for a long time, and I was very much exposed to the drinking water, and that was the biggest effect. It is being dealt with now, and at great expense, trying to filter the water. And it's an ongoing thing. That stuff is one of those things that does not leave the body easily and does not break down easily in the environment. And but I just thought I'd let you know about that. The local situation is that it also has a main street, which is businesses and stuff. And so we tap dance a lot around here. We talk about it amongst ourselves, but they don't want to scare all the tourists away. So, it's not quite as, it's pretty out here for the people here, but it's not, we don't try to get it out too far away. But it's going to be an ongoing problem. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. And there's many different, it's not just the PFOA and the PFAS too, we're finding out. And we are fortunate to have a group of scientists from the University of Rhode Island and elsewhere looking into all issues with it, because nationwide, people don't know that much about this stuff, and they're all trying to figure it out. But I just thought I'd throw that in there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say...
This is Doris.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you go ahead. I just wanted to make a comment about the PFAS.
Oh, please do. Go ahead.
Okay. Sierra Club is working on the PFAS issue. We work closely with the people on Cape Cod, and they have really been leaders in figuring out how to educate the public. But something that we have learned, even from industry's own materials, is that the filters that are being used by cities and by the military, called granulated activated carbon, do not filter out all the different PFA molecules. In fact, they don't filter out the one that is most common accumulating in food crops. And so we're just trying to get more information about this and alert people to the fact that these filters, carbon filters, don't take everything out, and then they have to be destroyed by incinerators, which is what's happening when they're full of contaminants. And when they're incinerated, incinerators don't really destroy these molecules which don't burn. The PFAS are so resistant, and only a really expensive treatment has been identified that can treat them. So we're just trying to get better information so that people really find the most effective way to deal with these chemicals that are so hard to treat. And of course, the incinerators, if they don't destroy them, they go up into the air, and air pollution equipment is not yet designed to deal with them, which is one of the problems with Gen X in North Carolina. So maybe Brian could write a story about this sometime, get some information about why some of these treatments are not effective, which would help a lot of people who are seeing their cities spend money on them. So that was my thought. I really appreciate it, especially the environmental justice component of this call, because these pollutants are everywhere, just like PCBs. They are not going away. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to respond?
I welcome story tips at any time from anybody, and you can definitely find my email on our site. And you guys are the last two commenters talking about PFAS. I mean, they're spot on. It's a problem that just keeps snowballing, and I want to say there's something like 15 million Americans currently drinking water with perfluorinated compounds in them. So this story is just getting underway, and there's going to be all kinds of angles to it. And I'm glad to hear some people are on the on the front lines of this and trying to learn and fight it. And I would welcome any story tips or comments or whatever to my email.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much. I do think that we are about out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and make some wrap-up comments. But first, Brian, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if there's anything else that you'd like to say before we close out the call. And thank you for, sharing the fact that you're looking for tips, because I think there's probably a lot of listeners who might be considering how to get the word out about what's happening in their communities. So this is a really great forum for getting excited about that. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I think, just to leave on a positive note, I think just the fact that you are a person, whoever you are out there, that is calling into this type of call and engaging on these issues and reading stories and sharing them with your neighbors, that you are doing a lot of good, and you're doing the right thing and getting the word out on these problems. So good on all of you, and I hope to hear from a lot of you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Brian, for joining us today, and to all of you out there for participating. Our next call will be announced within the next few weeks, so keep your eye out for more information about that. And finally, we hope you'll consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics in support of our monthly Che Alaska calls. Your contribution in any amount makes a difference and will help provide the support we need to continue bringing these calls throughout the year. You can give online at akaction.org. Again, thank you to everyone. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us by calling 222-7714. And also, I will be sending a link to the recording of this call, as well as those niche publications that Brian mentioned, where some of these community stories might get a foothold and start getting out there, and then lead to the copycat bigger outlets covering the same story. So thank you so much to everyone. Please do consider offering a contribution to help support these calls, and have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time.